Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to talk to everybody here today about beavers as architects of climate resilience. And I want to start off by saying climate is changing. And I probably don't have to convince anyone of this call on that, but every single decade is hotter than the last. We have been trying a lot of different things to slow this trajectory down, to get it back under control. And we may be making some progress on that. Maybe we are, maybe we aren't. That's not what I'm here to talk about. What I'm here to talk about is that we have already felt the effects of climate change, and there's more coming on the horizon. More than ever, we need to be thinking about how to adapt to and to mitigate some of the very real disasters and challenges we're facing today. We're seeing our forests, our prairies, our grasslands going up in smoke. We're watching our reservoirs draw down. We're losing our water resources. And then we see the rains coming, and it's almost worse that instead of that rain going back to where we need it, it's coming too much, too fast, all at once. And we see our valley bottoms, our towns, and our cities under floodwaters. This is a big challenge for us. And I have worked as an engineer myself. And when I see things like this, I immediately think, this is an engineering problem. We need to figure out a way to build our way out of this. There's so many challenges in front of us. We are such a smart species. We are so creative. Let's engineer it. And then I remember how expensive engineers are. And then I remember how much training it takes to be an engineer. And then I remember that this is a really, really big problem. And maybe we don't have enough engineers to tackle it. At least we don't have enough engineers on our own. Luckily, there is another engineer out there. And yes, I am talking about nature's engineers. If it wasn't already obvious, I'm here to talk to you today about beavers. And nature's engineers have a lot that they can bring to the table. Now, you would be completely within your rights if you're sitting there and you're thinking, hold up, beavers and climate change. This is not salt and pepper. This is not peanut butter and jelly. I have never said these words in a sentence together, and I honestly don't know why I ever would. And if you're feeling that way, that's okay. Throughout my talk, I hope that by the end of it, you will be convinced that maybe beavers and climate change is not peanut butter and jelly, but they do belong in a sentence together because they are fundamentally intertwined. And before I dig into the details of that, I want to take a little step back. And I want you to think about what North American rivers look like today. I'm showing you an aerial image of the Mississippi, and I like to show this because I think it's pretty exemplary of what a typical river is. We have confinement, whether it's being forced into a single corridor because of concrete channelization, or if it's just butting right up against agriculture or towns, or even open space and public lands. Our rivers are confined. And the Great Mississippi, which used to take up the entire Mississippi Valley bottom, which was huge, is pretty restricted in its movement today. But it wasn't always like that. And I want you to think now, what might a river have looked like 200, 300, maybe even 400 years ago? What did it look like before this massive scale of development? And if you're thinking about something like this, like these classic drawings of the Mississippi, where it's got its oxbows and its bends and its channels and its braids and its anastomoses and anabranches and all of the other big hydrology words to say that it's a big, complicated spaghetti mess of channels, this is more what rivers used to look like. This is more what healthy rivers should look like. They should look more like this today. But even this drawing, I want to point out that something is missing. And when this was drawn, there was something really important missing from the landscape. Now, I'm classically trained as a river scientist or a hydrologist or an ecohydrologist. And when I learned about the big names in my field, we have Strahler and Pack and Horton and Gilbert and Davis and Powell. All of these fellows were, discovering rivers for the first time in the 1800s and developing river science as a scientific discipline in the 1800s, late 1800s, into the 1900s. We're getting all of these equations and laws and rules for the physics of how rivers work. And they're pushing and they're thinking more about okay, it can go from straight to braided to meandering. And that was discovered in 1957. And we're understanding graded streams and drainage densities and stream orders. And that was in the 1940s. And then science continues to advance, and we're thinking about land use effects on rivers in the 60s. And, this field is developing in this really big and important way. But for every single decade that I'm showing you here on the history of my academic discipline, something was missing. And that something is missing in a really big way. So beavers have been around for a long time. Beavers learned to build dams at least 7.5 million years ago. It may have been as far back as 25 million years ago. We're not exactly sure when the dam building specifically evolved versus tree cutting. But the long and short of this slide is that I showed you about a 100-year period where we developed river science. And during that 100-year period, there weren't a lot of beavers in North America. For the past 7.499 million years before that 100-year period, beavers were working the North American continent, and they were working it in a really big way. This is a map of our river networks, where every single blue line is a stream or a brook or a creek or a river, and it drains down, and you get, our headwater streams are the finer lines, and we get into the big rivers, which are the thicker lines. And when I show you this, what I want you to know is that before the fur trade and before colonization of North America, over 50% of these streams were absolutely packed to the gills with beavers. They were everywhere. And they were building their dams in abundance on every single headwater stream. They were doing that. They were engineering for millions and millions and millions of years. And they were on the big rivers too. They just didn't build dams on the big river main channel itself. They built it more into the floodplains. And so beavers were everywhere. They were working at enormous spatial scales, and they were working for huge temporal scales. But then we killed almost every single one of them. Before the fur trade, there were 100 to 400 million beavers in North America. That's about 1 billion beaver dams on this continent. Then the fur trade happens, and we hit our post-fur low in the beaver population, right in the late 1800s through the mid-1900s, which does almost perfectly overlap with when river science developed as a field. During that time, we were down to about 100,000 beavers left, and it was honestly just through luck that they were able to survive at all. During that period, we went from 1 billion beaver dams to a few 100,000 beaver dams. This was a continental scale reshaping of the North American river networks. And today their populations are rebounding. I'm happy to say that, but we're nowhere near what it used to be. We have maybe 10 to 30 million beavers across the continent, 10% of that historic population, and it is not evenly distributed. There are pockets where the beavers are close to their prehistoric or their pre-trapping abundance. And then there are pockets where we still have almost no beavers left, and where maybe 200 years ago, it would have been full of beavers. So to remove 1 billion beaver dams in the geologic blink of an eye, and then to develop all of our river science in that same blink of an eye, there's a lot we really don't know about beavers. And hopefully, as I explain more about what they do and what they don't do, I want you to keep coming back to the sense of scale, how widespread they were on the North American continent, how long they were working on the North American continent. Because beavers are nature's engineers, and they work incredibly hard to radically reshape waterways. What I'm showing you on this slide is a pretty classic beaver dammed landscape. We have upland species, so pine trees and conifers and hardwoods and softwoods and all those big taller trees. They're sort of pushed back a little bit away from the river corridor. And then you move in towards the river and you shift from being tall trees down into sort of shrubby and reedy plants. This is what's called the herbaceous wetland. This is what the beaver wants to have engineered. The beaver dam here is cutting across the middle of the screen. We have water spilling over it. Water flows under it, around it, through it. We have deep pools of water. We have shallow runs of water. The fringes are warm and sunny. The pools are dark and cold. There's a huge mosaic happening here of habitats, of water types, of water qualities, of everything. And this is what we had spread across the North American continent. It's estimated that up to 1/3 of the land area in North America was influenced by beaver in some way. And so while we do have some pockets of this today, I didn't go back to the 1600s to take this photo. I did in fact take this today. Most of our waterways don't look like this. They look more like this drawing I've just popped up. Our streams are simplified, they're degraded. Many of them have sort of cut down into the earth away from their floodplains, away from the valley bottoms. This limits their ability to interact with soil. This limits their ability to interact with plants. And this limits them ecologically. This is a very weak and fragile river system when it looks like this. The smallest disturbance can send it awry into a cycle of further degradation. And this is a challenge for us as people engineers. We go out and we try to fix these things all the time. River restoration is a whole field of engineering. There's a lot of science, there's a lot of effort, but we're not the only ones thinking about it. And while we are spending quite a bit of time and effort and money spinning our wheels, trying to optimize river restoration for streams like this, beavers see it and they immediately know what to do. They have had 7.5 million years at least to develop their engineering plans. So they see a stream like this, Easy, build a dam. Now that dam is a leaky structure. This is not concrete and rebar like we build our dams with. This is sticks and stones and mud. And the beavers are going to build that dam to span the channel, and they want to bring the water back up to the floodplain. They want to make a little bit of a pond. And as they do that, it starts to build back up what we call the riparian or the creekside ecosystem. And so the beavers are slowing down the water and they're starting to build it back up, and you're starting to get this little patch of wetland. But busy as a beaver is a phrase for a real reason. They are absolutely not going to stop when they built one little bitty dam. They want to expand it. They want that dam to be longer. They want it to be taller. They want it to be stronger. They want it to hold back more water. And as they do that, it increases their area of influence. It increases the aquatic habitat. It increases the wetland habitat. And beavers are doing this for one reason. And that one reason is that they are awkward on land. If you were to see a beaver swimming in the water, you would think, this is such an agile and beautiful creature. It can swim smoothly. It can hold its breath for 15 minutes. In fact, they can outswim almost any predator. But take that beaver and put it on land, which technically is allowed. They are a semi-aquatic rodent, but they're built for water. They're not built for land. They have webbed feet on the back, little hands on the front, a big old paddle tail coming out of them on the rear end, and their body is shaped like a bowling ball. And if you weren't aware, an adult beaver can weigh anywhere from 40 up to 110 pounds. Now that 110 pounder came out of Wisconsin, and a lot of us Big Ten schools, we're in the realm of where the 110 pounders can come from. So this is a huge, awkward animal. The minute they're on the land, that is a gigantic chicken nugget for predators. And evolution has taught them that. That's why they're doing all this building. They're safe in the water. They're vulnerable on land. Their evolutionary solution, build more water habitat. And this has been wildly successful for them. But at some point, beavers need to go further afield. They need to go out a little bit farther away from their home pond and harvest more materials to build more dams, to increase their area of influence, and to make themselves safer. So instead of waddling around and putting themselves in the line of danger, what they do instead is they dig canals. And while beaver dams are probably the most obvious and well-known aspect of how beavers engineer landscapes, their canals are really probably even more influential. They take the beaver's area of influence and they expand it from single pond scale, which maybe at its largest is like an acre big, and they make it valley bottom scale. They make it geologic scale. They can massively increase the area of influence that a single beaver family has. And now if you were to visit one of these sites in the field, you would see something like this. And I like to show this slide primarily so that we all have the same terms in our heads when I'm talking for the rest of the talk. On the left-hand side, that's the beaver's dam. Now the dam is what's holding back water. The dam is a separate structure from the lodge. The lodge is what the beavers actually live in. That's the dome-shaped structure that you sometimes see in the middle of a pond or on a bank. And the beavers build it, they pile up all those sticks, and they chew out little rooms inside. In the background of this picture, you can see there's some beaver canals that have been drawn into the landscape surrounding the pond. The beavers on land are looking super awkward. Beavers in the water looking super slick and agile. Pretty typical beaver dam landscape. But it doesn't really do justice to just how big beaver engineering is. So what you're seeing are two of my field assistants on top of a beaver's lodge. And I have a drone flying above it, just going higher and higher and higher in altitude. And we've just now started to capture the first dam, and now the second dam is coming into view on our right-hand side. So the scale here is much larger than that little drawing indicates. The scale here that you are seeing as just two beaver dams as we go higher and higher up is still only a fraction of what a single beaver family would do. They don't build just one dam. They don't build just two dams. Beavers in their family unit, which is only 6 to 8 beavers big, are going to be building many dams. In fact, they can build 10, 15, 20 dams or more. And they'll maintain every single one of these, and they'll work on every single one of these. They'll make sure every single one of these is full of water. They can truly fill the river network. They can fill our stream corridors. And these are what beavers are doing today. Now imagine what they were doing when they filled every single headwater stream. Imagine how fundamentally different water moved across the North American landscape. And that's the kind of question that I think about, and that helps me tie beavers back to something that really is a continental scale process or global process like climate change. Through all of the complexity that they build, through their ponds, through their dams, through their canals, through the fundamental reshaping of a simple stream into a complex wetland, that's how beavers are acting as agents of resilience. Now, to make that point, I want to show you how beavers specifically are modifying the way water moves through the landscape. On the left, I'm going to show you a stream without beavers in conceptual diagram form, and we're looking at it from above. Now, on the right, this is the stream with beavers. So they built their dam, they have those canals radiating outwards. Canals also connect upstream to downstream. Sometimes folks think they just kind of fan perpendicular to the direction of the stream, but beavers don't want to waddle up and down their own dams. That's very awkward and vulnerable for them too. So they're going to connect upstream to downstream with little channels that they control. Now, when we have a wetter period, when there's a flood, if that flood is from a storm, or if it's from a lot of snow melt, or if it's from an atmospheric river, or if it's from something else, it doesn't matter why a flood is happening. When a flood wave initiates and starts to move through a stream that does not have good connection to the floodplain, which most of our degraded and incised streams don't, it is going to rip them to shreds. It has so much power and so little space. And we can think about this intuitively. If you have a garden hose and you put your thumb over the top of it and then turn the water on, what would have otherwise been a somewhat pleasant trickle of water becomes a pretty forceful spray. And that's basically what we have here. A lot of water is trying to move through a small space, and it has a lot more force. But when flood waves hit beaver wetlands, they are encountering deeper water, they're encountering wider water, and then every single one of these canals the beaver digs for themselves to be their own little water highways. This is what they like to, swim around and get their food and escape from predators in. It also is a super easy way for water to get out onto the floodplain, where it will then encounter this very dense and rich vegetation community, which further slows it down, which helps knock some of the debris and sediment out of our flood waves. And the water still goes downstream. Remember, they're not stopping the water. They're not building like we build. The water will make it downstream, albeit in a slower and less destructive way. And so instead of seeing large-scale erosion and soil loss and scouring across our river corridors, instead what we see is that if there are beavers, water is being spread and slowed and stored. And that's really important when we then have the opposite of a flood. So right now, again, I'm showing you our stream without beavers and our stream with beavers. And instead of looking at it from above, we're now going to look at it with depth. So we've got the vegetation along the top of these diagrams. I've set our water table pretty deep. That's groundwater. So if you wanted to dig until you hit water, you usually have to dig pretty far down, especially during summertime. Our streams, when they're narrow and degraded, don't have a big impact on soil water. It's pretty small in space. Versus our streams with beavers, because the pond is really wide and they have all those canals that are basically little micro streams, there's very strong connection to the soil water. However, if it's raining, if it's a nice wettish period, the plants really don't care where they're getting their water from. They can get it from the soil, they can get it from rain from above. It's not their problem. They're green and healthy and happy regardless. The minute we cut off that precipitation, as soon as we enter somewhat of a drought, whether that's your usual summertime droughts or it's a big prolonged multi-year drought, those plants are now much more reliant on water that has been stored in the soil. Our streams, when they're incised and degraded, they don't store water very well. Water moves through them really quickly. It pulls them apart. There's little connection to the floodplain. And so what we see is that a lot of those plants that were growing and building up a lot of biomass during our wet periods suddenly don't have enough water. So they'll start to wilt and wither and shut down. Now, this is not true where the beavers were working. Because they were so good at slowing down that flood wave, they also gave the water enough time to sink out into the floodplain soils. And then those plants, when they don't have rain, they can just drink water from below. So they stay green and healthy. This isn't just a conceptual model. This is something that I have personally studied and also something that some of my colleagues have studied. And we typically use remote sensing and aerial surveys to observe this effect. And we've seen over and over and over again, beaver wetlands are able to buffer the effects of drought. They resist drought stress in the vegetation there. And this is true in dry places like Nevada that I've studied. This is also true in wet places like the boreal wetlands of Western Canada, like my colleague Glennis Hood has studied. So we know beavers are really good at withstanding droughts. And I was thinking about this a lot when I first started studying beavers, because every time I heard someone talking about droughts on the news, the very next sentence was, it's also probably going to be a bad fire year because it was such a bad drought year. And that left me wondering, well, if beaver wetlands are not feeling droughts really, are they going to feel fires? If we have one careless match or a power line or a campfire, whatever it is that going to burn both of these things equivalently? My conceptual model would say no. It would say, well, our dry vegetation is by these incised and degraded streams, so that will burn. But our beaver wetland is green and lush and healthy, and so that would not burn. And to me, this felt intuitive. And it may feel intuitive to you. Let's say we were going to go on a camping trip and I was getting the camp kitchen ready and I was like, okay, can you run out into the woods and get me some stuff to start a fire? If you came back with an armful of wet green leaves and bendy wet green sticks, we're not starting a fire. We're not going to have a hot dinner. And we're probably not going camping together anymore. That is the exact same thing that's happening here. The beaver wetlands are full of wet leaves, bendy green sticks. The rivers that don't have beavers on them and the lakes that don't have beavers on them, they're surrounded by that dry, crunchy vegetation that you would look for to start a fire. Now, I want to be clear, this is not just a conceptual model. This is something we have also seen. These photos are from my colleague, Dr. Joe Wheaton at Utah State University of the Sharps Fire, which burned in Idaho back in 2018. Now, in the Sharps Fire, it was a pretty significant fire in Idaho. We had large amounts of burning and the flames were coming down the hill slopes. And in many places, especially where there were not beavers, they were burning straight through the river bottoms, right across the valley. Very little vegetation left behind, in some places none, and the entire riparian ecosystem was destroyed. And then it goes back up the other side and then does the same thing the next valley over. Where we had the beavers, it was a different effect though. The fire came down the hill slopes, just the same. Beavers are awkward. They're not climbing mountains to do their engineering. They're staying down low. But when it got down to where they were working, it was not able to burn that. And it kind of stalls. And eventually, in a lot of these places, the winds are high enough that an ember will blow to the other side and it'll ultimately catch and keep going. But that valley bottom is protected. And when you zoom in more closely, you can very clearly see it's not even enough for the streams to be kind of wiggly. It's not enough to have a meander or two. They still burned. All those little white splotches in that left-hand picture, that's ash piles where there used to be willows. This was high severity burning. This was bad fire. There is a lot of fire that is good fire. There's a lot of fire that we need. We do not need the entire ecological community erased and the organics burnt out of the soil at the scale that we're seeing. And luckily for us, the beavers didn't let that happen. The fire came down still super hot, still burning the soil as it made its way down the hill slopes. But once it hit the beaver wetland, and you can see the amount of water that's stored here, you can see it reflecting light back up at the drone, the dams, the canals, the complexity, and you can see the mature adult vegetation that's preserved here. The beavers did that because water doesn't burn, and beaver complexes are quite wet. So I wanted to ask, as a scientist, is this something we can rely on? Do beavers keep riparian ecosystems green during fire consistently, or was this a rare effect? And to answer that question, I decided to look at 5 different fires across the American West. And I will say this study started off with 10 fires. And I was early in my career as a remote sensing scientist, and I learned very quickly how cloud cover can cause challenges. And not only clouds, but also smoke cover. And so when you're studying fires and you're trying to understand what's going on, smoke can kind of filter your data set down. So if you're listening in your early career, a pro tip is always select more study sites than you think you need, because you'll probably lose some for things out of your control. So anyways, I was looking at these 5 fires: California, Colorado, Idaho, Wyoming, and Oregon. At the time of this study, I thought they were all like really big, dramatic fires. I definitely don't think that anymore, and I'm going to come back to that. But I liked this setup because I had a lot of different types of land cover here. I had alpine forests, I had lowland forests, I had grasslands, I had rocky landscapes, I had sageland and scrubland and all sorts of other things. And within each of these fires, there was a lot of different types of burning, and there were a lot of beaver dams. So I felt like, okay, if I have all of these different contexts, I should be able to find in what circumstances are beavers able to create these patches of what's called fire refugia, or unburnt area, and in what circumstances are they not. To answer that question, I want you to imagine that you walk along every single creek in my study areas, and you do it from a designated starting point to a designated stopping point. And you're going to do one walk right before the fire, and then you're going to do one walk right after the fire. As you walk along, you stay as close to the river as possible, and you're making notes. How green are the plants? And do I see beaver dams or signs of beaver engineering like canals or lodges? This is basically what we did, except instead of walking along them, we looked at satellite images and extracted the pixel values of greenness along the river corridor, and we were able to map out if we could see presence of beaver along the river corridor. So it was a remote sensing approach to something that you could probably imagine doing in the field. And I was very grateful to have remote sensing, because I'm not going to go walk through wildfire. So when I want to study a fire effect, when it's still actively in the area and it's very dangerous, it's so nice that a satellite can be in there taking data for me. Now, the measure of greenness I used is something called NDVI, Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. This is a really nice and commonly used satellite measure where it can sense basically the greenness of plants. Plants are going to go from green to black or brown when they burn, so this should be a good way for me to evaluate the amount of burning happening. And I want to note that it does depend on both the abundance of plants and the health of the plants within a given pixel. So having small pixel sizes is really important for relatively narrow parts of the landscape, like a river corridor. So this is how I'm seeing if the plants are green. And to see where the beavers are, we can actually look in satellite images. Very high resolution is great, but everything up to about a 3x3 meter pixel is pretty easy to find beaver dams in. My team does this all the time now. And if you are not familiar with finding beaver dams and beaver engineering in satellite, I've highlighted basically our process here. So every single one of these yellow lines is what we are able to identify as a beaver dam. All of the little canals or channels they're digging, those are our little blue lines. And then the beaver's lodge I've circled in pink here. Now, this is a skill that we've developed from doing a lot of satellite work over time and also visiting a lot of beaver ponds on ground to see what do they actually look like, get the drone up to get that aerial view, and then go higher and higher and higher and close the gap between field studies and true remote sensing studies. Now I'm going to show you just a snippet of my data from the Mantor Fire, which burned in the Domeland Wilderness of Sequoia National Forest back in 2000. It's a 79,000 acre fire. Mild spoiler on this slide is me standing in front of a beaver dam. I was not the age in that picture back in 2000. So clearly the beavers are still there relatively recently. However, that does not mean that they did well during the fire. So I'm getting very excited about this study and I'm like, all right, I've got this awesome data. I've mapped out a bunch of beaver dams. We're going to see how it happened and I'm going to solve the wildfire crisis and all of these just like escalating thoughts of a young scientist working on what I found to be a very exciting project. But I also like to stay pretty grounded in my work. And when working with something that is a disaster, I like to try to find people's firsthand accounts of what these were like to give myself some context and perspective on exactly what it is I'm studying. So I'm going to read you a quote from the LA Times about the Mantor Fire. It is a humbling expression of nature, walls of flame 70 feet high, twice as high as the nearest tree, leaping through canyons and valleys, at times in 5 directions at once. Left behind, quite literally, is scorched earth. So it's a pretty bad fire. And beavers are big. Like, I think I made that clear talking about the big guy from Wisconsin, the 110-pounder. But beavers are not 70 feet high. And beavers don't leap through canyons and valleys. This is a serious challenge for beavers and their ecosystem engineering. This is the kind of thing that they're up against. This is the kind of thing we struggle to manage. And I'm expecting a giant semi-aquatic rodent to do it. So while this part of the research did knock the wind out of my sails just a bit, I was still very excited to see what the data showed, and I'm going to share that with you today. So this is a plot of distance along profile, stream profiles here on our x-axis, and then NDVI or plant greenness on the y. And so 0 on our x-axis, that's like your designated starting point on a stream. And then you walk, 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 walk. And then on this one, 4,000 is you've walked 4,000 meters along the stream, and that's where you stopped down at 4,000. I'm going to be showing you the greenness where 0 would indicate less or fewer green plants and NDVI goes all the way up to 1, but you really don't see it go that high unless you're in a jungle. So anything sort of in the higher numbers of NDVI indicates that we have more green plants. And before the fire, our greenness looks something like this. For the select people in the audience that work a lot with NDVI, you can probably already start to make some interpretations. And if you're not, you are part of the majority. Most people don't look at this kind of data day in and day out. So I've put a dashed line on here that's important. NDVI of 0.3 is the minimum value we expect in a healthy and densely vegetated riparian zone during the summer growing season, which is when this data is taken. Now you'll notice there are a couple spots where it dips below. That's okay. The Domeland Wilderness is a very rocky place. And so sometimes we have a huge boulder. And it is just a big boulder outcrop, and there's nothing you can do about that. Plants aren't going to grow on that. And so you have fewer green plants within your pixel. You get a slightly lower NDVI. Anything above 0.3, to me, that says we're doing good. The plants are happy and healthy. So before the fire, most of the plants are pretty happy and healthy. And then the fire happens. And for a while, it seems like the plants were okay, but then they just drop, and we stay below 0.3 significantly for the rest of the walk along the stream. If you overlay where we found beaver dams as little black boxes along the x-axis, and you really isolate where the beavers were working versus where they were not, a pattern starts to pop out at me. It seems that maybe where the beavers were working, we saw a different effect pre and post fire versus where they were not. And to isolate that difference that we saw even more, I'm now showing you the difference. So here, a higher number is more impact from the fire, a lower number is less impact. All I've done is difference the NDVI. And you can see that very clearly, where we have beaver dams, we have fire suppression. We do not burn as significantly if there are beaver dams present. As soon as we get out of the beaver dammed areas, we see significant fire effects. And I didn't see this just on one creek. I saw this on every single creek and every single fire in my whole study. This was an incredibly consistent and repeatable and reliable phenomena. And for those of you that have ever published a paper, or for those of you that may try to publish a paper in the future, I will say right now that I think the crowning achievement of my career was getting the title Smokey the Beaver through peer review. Usually people want very dry and technical titles, and I was so excited about these results. I was ready to just get the word out there. I wanted a catchy title that people could relate to, and that was Smokey. Because what I found was that the beaver dammed areas were burning 3 times less intensely than river corridors that didn't have beavers within them. And I was talking to people about this after I found it. Like I said, I was very excited about it. And I connected with some US Forest Service folks, and I was mentioning, I wish I had been there in the Manter fire. I had such strong fire resistance in these beaver wetlands. I wish I could have seen that. And on one of these calls, one of the guys was like, actually, I was there. I worked on the burned area emergency response team, and you wouldn't believe what we took a bunch of photos of out of the airplane window. And that's the photo on this slide. This is from the Manter fire back in 2000, a solid 15 years before I even started thinking about beavers and wildfire. And they were doing their post-fire surveying, and they kept zooming in on these beaver dams because they were noticing this is the only thing that's not burning. We have those burnt trees root to tip, consumed by the 70-foot walls of flame. We have huge patches of what is quite literally scorched earth, but we also have greenery, and we also have clear water and healthy ecosystem, and that's where the beavers were working. And it's not just the beavers that are using these patches. They found all sorts of other plants and animals that had survived the fire. They found this black bear hunkering down in a beaver wetland, just waiting it out. He's basically in the grocery store now. All the other plants and animals are coming over. And so he survived. An adult, mature species survived. And I like to show this because I think it points to the fact that beavers do all this engineering because they're selfish. They want to be safe. They want to be able to swim away from predators. But it has all of these sort of ripple effects for other species. I also like to show this because it sets me up to make the dorkiest joke ever, which is that it looks like Smokey Bear got a little helping hand from Smokey the Beaver. So I'm just assuming everybody's laughing heartily to themselves at this right now. At this point in my research, I feel really positively about sort of the future of fire mitigation and working with nature, nature-based solutions, or whatever buzzwords you want to throw on it. But then 2020 happened, which was a tough year for many reasons, but it was one of the worst wildfire years we've had in a long time. And it made me realize that we're in the age of megafires now. And I say even here on this slide, because it doesn't matter where you are in North America, even here applies to you. If you're in Oregon, you are in the age of megafires. If you're in California, you are in the age of megafires. Those 2 states probably already knew that. If you're in Minnesota, you are in the age of megafires. We had one recently, the Greenwood Fire, and our neighbors to the north in Ontario have had enormous megafires. If you're in Texas, megafires. If you're in anywhere, basically, in North America, you are in the age of megafires. And megafires are a different beast. Megafire is not like the fires I studied before, for the most part. The definition of megafire that I'm using here is a fire that has a burn area of larger than 100,000 acres. And I want to be super clear, fire is not bad. Megafire doesn't necessarily have to be bad. A lot of fires are big and do good things for the ecosystem. But many of the megafires we see today got to be that size because they are exhibiting really extreme and often self-sustaining behaviors. They literally will create their own weather systems, making things called pyrocumulus clouds, which look like a thunderhead, but instead of rain coming down, it rains down ash and embers. These start secondary ignitions, which merge with the primary, make it even bigger, and then that can create a pyrocumulonimbus cloud, which is sometimes affectionately or disaffectionately referred to as the fire-breathing dragon of clouds. And this is because if you've seen any of those viral videos of a fire tornado or a fire storm, where it looks like these other disasters that we are aware of and also cannot control, except it's made out of flames. When you have these really extreme behaviors, fires can spread really fast. They can go 100,000 acres in a day. We cannot keep up with that. We cannot manage a fire that is spreading that fast. All we can do is try to save people, property, and infrastructure. And that's a challenge. And then there's more challenges because everywhere it goes when it's burning that fast, it's also burning extremely hot. And it leaves behind these huge swaths of moderate and severe burning. And it's okay to have moderate and severe sprinkled around. We like that. That's called pyrodiversity, or you make a pyromosaic. That can actually make you more resilient in the future to other fires. But when we have it all together, we have 60,000 acres of severe burning all together, that's not good. That's ecosystem destroying fire. And that's what beavers are up against. So I wanted to know if these beaver-created fire refugia, or unburnt patches, can persist even through really extreme fire behavior. Now, to answer that question, luckily or unluckily, depending on who you ask, Rocky Mountains experienced really significant megafires in 2020. They had not had fires like this really for about 100 years. There's a big fire here, maybe a big fire there. And then 2020, they had 3 really big fires all at once that were threatening to merge with one another at times. There was the Mullen Fire to the north, Cameron Peak, and then East Troublesome moving south. The map I'm showing you is burn severity, and you really don't need to know any of the colors except for red, which is hot and high. That is high burn severity. That is really destructive fire. Each of these fires was megafire in size. They're all about 200,000 acres, and also in behavior. They had really extreme behaviors. East Troublesome was the one that spread almost 100,000 acres in a day. Cameron Peak jumped the Continental Divide. The Mullen Fire spread so fast, it was really, really hard to get ahead of it. Also somewhat unique about these fires is that they started pretty late. The earliest start was in August, and East Troublesome didn't even start until October 14th. This is not what we usually expect to be the fire season. We don't think about fire being a December problem, or at least we didn't until these kinds of ones started happening. But we can see beaver complexes staying green, right? So I'm looking at my satellite image. I do this all the time. I've already found all the beaver dams. If you don't do this all the time, it's pretty easy to find those beaver dams once everything burns, because they're the only thing that has greenness around them. Here, every single beaver pond is that little black wedge. But this greenery, just like measuring the brute greenness with something like NDVI, this was a challenge because of the timing of these fires. I was living in California when these happened, and I was in the coast, and we don't really have seasons in coastal California. But I was reminded that Colorado does, especially the Rocky Mountains. And so looking at my NDVI curves, it was difficult for me to parse out exactly how much of the loss of greenness was from fire versus how much of the loss of greenness was because we were in the thick of autumn and the trees were just dropping their leaves. And so as much as I wanted to be consistent and keep using NDVI to truly just probe that plant greenness, I had to decide to use a different measure. So I went to DNBR, differential normalized burn ratio. It's very similar to NDVI, except this one is taking an image before and an image after, and then differencing it to figure out exactly how burnt a given pixel is. And it picks up on both healthy vegetation, but also burned areas more generally. And so it can sort of see through that seasonal signature because you set your image dates, so like July of one year and then July of the year after the fire. You don't need to sample right when the fire is happening. There's a lot that goes into DNBR, but all you really need to know is that a higher value indicates that an area is more burnt. And when we use DNBR, what we can do is figure out exactly where those beavers are, and then look at every single pixel and say exactly how burnt is this, and say that in the language that our fire managers and our landscape managers are speaking. They speak in terms of high severity, moderate severity, low severity, unburnt, and that's what my data will say as well. And lo and behold, even though I had 1,500 beaver dams and 3 of some of the worst fires that I'd ever expected, and I was certain I would find when and where these beavers cannot resist fire, and when their wetlands burn, in every single one of these fires, I found that the beaver dammed areas were extremely fire resistant. And if I broke it out by where I was in the fire, if I was outside the river network, only 40% of that area was fire refugia. That's not even a coin flip. That is not as much as we would expect given a healthy fire regime. That is too much moderate and severe burning. And if we go into the rivers, which you would think this is a safe place, this is a place with water, you would be wrong 40% of the time. Only 60% of that area was wildfire refugia, which is not what you would expect from a river. If you go where the beavers are working, though, 89% of that area was fire refugia. Now, immediately, I'm with you. What about the 11% that was not? What was going on there? 2 things. Thing number one, the perimeter effect. So our pixels, even our really nice little tiny Sentinel-2 10x10s, when they're on the edge of a beaver wetland and the upland, we get a little bit of an edge effect. We tried to mask out all of those pixels as best we could, but then we also saw a perimeter effect where when the fire is coming from the uplands and it's burning super, super hot, high severity, it does take some amount of space to go from high severity to unburnt. And oftentimes that space is about 1 to 2 pixels wide. So we get this sort of singeing right around the outside of the beaver wetlands, even if the overall wetland complex is unburnt. So that's where most of that 11% was. It was edge effects. There was also a few examples. I think it was no more than 10 in all of these. We had 1,500 beaver dams, so no more than 10 of them, where we actually saw the beaver wetlands burn. And what happened there was almost every single time those beavers had just built their dams that summer. So the dam is constructed in June or July. They haven't really had a rainy season yet. They're doing their best to store water, and then August, the fire starts. And so they didn't get that first part of the cycle. They never got to slow down the water and store it. So they were still a pretty dry landscape. And in those situations, we did see the fire come through more significantly. But overall, this is still really reassuring. The beavers are creating pretty consistent wildfire refugia, even in some of the worst fires we've ever seen. And again, it's not just something we see in satellite. I go and visit these on ground. I go and fly my drones, and we see forests consumed by fire, absolutely burnt to a crisp. You can see it here on the left-hand side of the image. There's very high severity burning. And then it comes up to the edge of the beaver wetland where we have that chain of beaver ponds, just like the one I showed you in the video before, and it stops. And in this case, it was pretty special. It didn't burn all of the other side. When we have back-to-back beaver dams, when they are working like they were for the millions of years before they were extirpated across the continent, we can even see the fire behavior get changed by the beaver wetlands. It's not just a patch of fire refugia. Sometimes we get a fire break. Not always, sometimes the wind overcomes that, but it can happen. And this should make sense to us. When we go out to try to engineer our fire breaks, we bring out the lawnmowers and we bring out the fire retardant. And that's sort of what the beavers have done. They're out there chewing on the vegetation. They are the lawnmowers, and they're storing water, and that's their fire retardant. And so this is a really beneficial thing for us to think about as we face increasingly large fires that are increasingly hard for us to manage on our own. And maybe you're thinking, okay, that was 2 examples from the Western US. Is this just a Western US phenomenon? And I have also asked this because I live in Minnesota and I work at the University of Minnesota, and I know our state's history with fire, and I worry about our state's future with fire. And I am happy to say that some of my colleagues, completely independent of me, did a study in the Boreal Shield of Ontario, and they looked at fires, and they found that over 90% of fire-resistant wetlands in the Boreal Shield were associated with beaver dams. So there's already other data to be a little bit of a reassurance that actually this happens in soggy and flat places too, although the mechanisms may be a little bit different. I've also started to look at this myself in the Greenwood fire, which I mentioned. We'd had a mega fire fairly recently. That was the Greenwood, which burned in 2021 up by the Boundary Waters. And within the Greenwood fire's perimeter, we saw active beaver wetlands create very strong fire refugia. And something that I have finally gotten to see looking at some of these sort of Midwest and Great Lakes wildfires is there are also places where the beaver ponds are not active, where we have evidence that the beavers have been removed and their ponds have drained, but you can still sort of see their footprint on the landscape. In our higher gradient and faster moving drainages, sometimes the evidence of beavers gets sort of erased if the dam is removed or the beavers are removed. But here they leave this footprint on the landscape longer. And when the fire comes through, we can see these sort of shadows of beaver wetlands past, where it does burn, but it's not quite as bad as everywhere else. And those are places where the beavers haven't necessarily been working for decades, and yet their influence still persists. And this makes me wonder, how much of our landscapes here, especially in the Great Lakes region, are relatively fire resistant because of the ghosts of beavers past? And I don't have an answer to that, but it is something I like to think about. I have started to think more broadly, looking across these spatial scales, looking across these different geographic contexts, spatiotemporal, all of it included. Why and how are beavers so good at this? Why are they constantly making these fireproof patches? How have they done something that we struggle to do as humans? And I think it comes down to the fact that they're doing 4 different things that all create fire resistance. Some of the things create really strong fire resistance, like storing water. Water doesn't burn, water's wet. Very, very strong effect. But if you drain the pond, the water's gone and you lose that. But they're also storing it in the floodplain soils, which takes a little bit longer, but also has a pretty strong effect. And they're also thinning fuels. They go out there chewing trees, eating grasses all the time. We do that too. This takes long time scales to develop, that truly thinned forest effect. And the fire resistance you see can also persist longer. And then over time, they do transform ecosystems. They go from forest to wetland, and this happens over decades. And that fire resistance, driven by those small vegetation patch sizes, can also last for decades. So beavers are so good at this because they're doing all four at once. They are not putting all their eggs in one basket. They are not just storing water. They are storing water above ground. They're storing water below ground. They are thinning fuels. They are changing vegetation. They are doing all these different things that contribute to fire resistance simultaneously. And these patches are important. If you were a beaver or any other animal or person trying to escape a fire, and you went to the beaver pond, this would be your view. If you just keep your eyes kind of low, you wouldn't necessarily know that you were in a fire. There's green vegetation, there's cool, clear water. If you were to visit this, there's the sounds of fish jumping, there's birds calling, which is very, very different than the forest nearby, where things are burnt to the tips. Where when I drove up to this field site, it was creepy because it was so quiet. There were no leaves to rustle, there were no bugs, no birds, everything was dead until we got to the beaver wetland. And after the fire, when all of your vegetation is burnt off and your hill slopes are unstable and that washes down in a big mud flow, what is there to catch that flood wave? The beaver wetlands, and the cycle continues. Beavers' manipulation of how water moves through the landscape is a continuous circle that continues to feed back into stronger and stronger and stronger landscape scale resilience. And if you're somehow not convinced by data or hope or ecology or anything like that, I would like to offer to you a $sign that you can quote to people. There have been some cool studies that have tried to evaluate the monetary contributions that different aspects of nature-based solutions provide to people. And this one looked at beavers, and they found that through all the things beavers do, moderation of extreme events, and I will note this paper came out before the fire research, so they did not consider fire in this number, but habitat and biodiversity provisioning, water purification, water supply, greenhouse gas sequestration, recreational hunting and fishing. Beavers are doing all these things. I only talked about the disasters, but there's so much more to them. And it's worth $179,000 per square mile engineered per year. That's a lot of value. We pay engineers $179,000, which is fair. I'm all about a livable wage. But this is an enormous amount of money to think about spending. And it should in turn feel like an enormous amount of benefits to be getting from beavers. You don't need that many beavers to engineer a square mile. I've shown you the scale that a single family can work. Their territory is 1 to 2 kilometers of stream length. Now scale that up across North America. Think about the monetary value of these creatures that we mostly don't consider to be valuable. So maybe you're now at the point where you're going, all right, I'm sold. They are peanut butter and jelly. Beavers and climate change go together. Now what? Is it time for us to start airdropping them across North America again? This is an again statement. This is real. In the 1940s and 50s, Idaho Fish and Game and California Fish and Game were making use of surplus parachutes after the war and trying to figure out how to get beavers back into the mountains to help us with water resources. So they put the beavers in boxes, attached a parachute, and pushed them out. You can look this up on YouTube. I'm not going to dwell on it, but I will say it is not time to start airdropping beavers across North America again. It is time for us to start reevaluating our relationship with beavers. Somewhere between 25 and 28,000 beavers are still killed every single year in the United States for nuisance reasons, meaning that they are killed because we think they're causing a conflict with something else we like. Sometimes those conflicts are real. They chewed on my favorite tree. They flooded my house. Sometimes they are not real, where people are worried that they might hurt another species without having data to support that. Sometimes we blow up their dams with dynamite or tannerite today. Sometimes we pull them apart with a rake. We are removing this powerful ecosystem engineer and not really thinking about the fact that removing one family of beavers is changing a large area. It's not just taking away an animal, it's taking away a 1 to 2 kilometer long wetland. So we started making compromises with them too. Not everybody kills beavers anymore. Sometimes we'll wrap our trees in fencing with mixed success. Here's me with a tree that was wrapped in fencing. It's chewed. Turns out if you wrap it only about half a beaver height high, the beaver can push the fence down and get it anyways. So there's lessons to be learned and adaptations to be made, but we're engineers, we're smart too. Turns out we can also just put a pipe through the beaver dam. These are called a pond leveler, and you can reduce flooding without completely draining off the wetland. Your road doesn't go underwater, and you keep the beavers. And in some places, we move beavers. If they were, causing a problem and they are not wanted, but maybe they're wanted in the national park next door or the national forest nearby, you can pick them up and move them. This is not legal everywhere. It's not legal in Minnesota. It's not legal in quite a few places, but that's changing. It wasn't legal in California until very recently when they decided, oops, turns out beavers are really important. And we need them to fight droughts and fires. So let's make moving them legal again. Let's do it carefully. Beavers are sensitive. They have very tight family structures. You can't move just one. You have to move everybody. So it's not a silver bullet here. But it's just one of the ways that we can think more sustainably and proactively about working and living with beavers. And so when I think about our beaver future, I get asked this a lot. What does it look like to you when we've succeeded? And it'll never look like it did 400 years ago. It'll never look like when we had 100 to 400 million beavers in North America. There's way more people. There's way more needs for people. Land use has changed in a big way. And beavers have been harmed in a big way. So it's not going to be that. There is a lot of room for improvement. I don't think we are stuck at 10%. I think we could have more beavers in a lot of places, and I think we should have more beavers in a lot of places. But more importantly than that, when I think about our beaver future, what I think about is, we've reached success coexisting with this powerful engineer where when someone sees one, they see a beaver or they see a beaver dam or they see a chewed tree, their first gut instinct is, wow, this is incredible. I am here witnessing one of the most powerful animals on planet Earth, an animal that has literally shaped this continent, and I get to see it, and that's cool. And that's their reaction. Their reaction isn't, ew, a big water rat. Their reaction isn't, uh-oh, it's going to chew my tree, let's kill it. Their reaction is, wow, powerful creature. Maybe annoying creature, that's fine, but powerful creature that deserves respect, and creature that if we are careful with it and we work closely with it, can help us dig ourselves out of one of the biggest messes that faces mankind today, which is climate change. So hopefully you're convinced, and I want to say thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions that have come in while I was chatting. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you. We do have several questions. We have actually 6 in the Q&A. The first one is from Patty Ditto. Are engineers trying to replicate what beavers do?
Excellent question, and the answer is yes. We call these Beaver Dam Analogs, or BDAs, where we go out and we try to make a beaver dam to simulate some of what beavers can do. A lot of times the goal of a BDA is to restore the habitat enough so that real beavers will come back. And I've worked on some BDA builds, and one of my favorite stories of them is we had a bunch of BDAs built on this restoration site. We were trying to do Beaver Dam analogs, mimic the beavers, bring back the beavers, and the beavers moved in and they disagreed about where we built our BDAs and how we built our BDAs. And so they tore some of them apart, used the materials, and then built their own dams. Or in some places, they would build it 6 inches away from our dam. They're like, you placed it wrong. It should have been here. Sometimes they'll take them over directly, and that's like the stamp of beaver approval. So all of that is to say, yes, beavers are being mimicked by human engineers, but the skill of the mimicry is still highly variable, and beavers are the best judge of if we did a good job.
We have an anonymous question. How do beaver numbers today compared to numbers several hundred years ago?
It depends on where you're at. So if you're in the boundary waters of northern Minnesota, then you are probably close to maybe 50 to 70% of historic. Places that don't have a lot of development are more likely to have healthy beaver populations. If you're in the Twin Cities and Minneapolis, we're probably at less than 2% of historic beaver populations. So urban areas, agricultural areas, much lower percentages relative to historic. There's also states that have just really struggled to bring back their beavers. Either the waterways are really, really modified, or the connectivity between active beaver habitats is very disrupted. So for example, Eastern Oregon has relatively low beaver populations because it's very, very dry now, and the beavers they do have are not connected to other areas of good habitat, so it's hard for them to rebound. Places like that are probably at 10% or less.
Neil Tong asks, are you using machine learning to determine beaver lodges and dams now?
That's a great question, and we are. I collaborated with a team at Google for the last few years to build what we have affectionately named the EAGER model, Earth Engine Automated Geospatial Elements Recognition. It's an AI model, a convolutional neural network that we have fed a lot of these satellite images that are labeled as Beaver Dam, Beaver Dam, Beaver Dam, and it's learning to go through satellite and aerial imagery and automatically detect them for us. It's a big question and has room for improvement. Beaver dams are extraordinarily variable in how they're built, and there's some random variation, but also some geographic variations. So model is functional now. It is undergoing further training to become like an awesome model.
Okay, we have Jill Vance says, this is wonderful. I work at a large reservoir property in Indiana with lots of beavers in our backwater, and this is super useful info. And we had somebody that mentioned Smoky, some variations on how to spell Smoky. Um, Anna Roll asked, wonderful research. Can you talk about how you share your findings with the public and encourage people who may not want beavers in their area to see the many beaver benefits? It seems like you have great ideas and about making your research accessible. And I'll kind of follow up on that. If anybody hasn't seen it on YouTube, there is a very cool stop animation video that I think is a very neat way to describe this.
Yeah, that's a great question. I care a lot about communicating my research because I see it as a positive path forwards. And I'm a relatively young person. I would like there to be a planet in 40 years for me. So if beavers are part of that, I'm going to go out there and advocate for those beavers as long as my data supports it, which it still does. So I give a lot of talks. I guide nature walks. I've found that a lot of people have these sort of ideas about beavers, and some of them are true, like beavers are big and beavers will slap their tails loudly at you and they're kind of territorial. But there's also these thoughts about beavers that are not true. People think, oh, they're really aggressive, or they'll eat all the fish. Beavers don't eat fish. Or some people think, oh, if I let beavers onto my property, I'm suddenly going to have 10,000 beavers or 500 beavers or even just 50 beavers, and it's too many beavers. And people don't really interact with this animal and they don't interact with the environment. So they just build up this idea of like a stinky wetland run by an army of beavers and it sucks. And so I guide all these walks with different nonprofit organizations that I partner with out to beaver wetlands and explain every step along the way. What are you seeing? And what is the truth of a beaver wetland? And do you like birding? Guess how many birds come visit the beaver wetlands? Do you like fishing? Guess how huge and happy the fish are in the beaver ponds. Did you know that beavers are really territorial and your best defense against other beavers is actually your resident beavers? They'll kill each other if they try to come into the territory. So if you don't want 100 beavers, make friends with one family and then let them do the fighting. And so just a lot of this very experiential education as much as I can. And for what I can't do experientially, I work really hard to provide sort of one pagers or photos or things to just show off like what are beavers doing if you personally cannot go visit one of these sites. A lot of people didn't know that they interacted with wildfire like this. So I share my shots of beavers and wildfires on social media and with all my community partners. I'll say I also partner heavily with organizations that are better at communication than I am to things like policymakers and federal agencies. And that's been a really effective way for me to get my message out there. And also a way for me to be able to stay, I'm a scientist, I'm taking data, I'm explaining my data. I'm going to let the people who know the policy figure out how that fits into their policy realm. So a lot of active collaboration across disciplines as well.
Another question. There's a few more rolling in. Is there research from other continents that support what you're learning about beavers in North America? Do other animals fill this niche on continents without beavers?
That is a great question. There are other animals that fight fires, and there's a really cool article that just came out. I think the journalist's name is Annie Roth, and she wrote about nature's firefighters. And so beavers are one of them in North America. And they're really important in North America, I want to be clear, because they were controlling North American streams for 7.5 million years. So the landscapes, the fire regimes, everything that we have here was developed with heavy beaver influence, and that's why we need them back today in such large numbers. In places where beavers never were, there are other animals that affect fire. A lot of the animals that dig, like pocket gophers, can affect fire. I believe in Annie's article, pangolins and elephants are also out there affecting fire processes. The sort of undercurrent of all of this research is that nature and animals, especially, can really self-regulate in a lot of ways, but we won't notice it unless we look for it. I often ask, like, what are the other beavers here? What were bison doing before we extirpated most of them? What about prairie dogs? What were they doing? These are both hydrologic engineers. Bison make wallows that are shallow wetlands. Prairie dogs dig the greatest underground tunnel network we've ever seen. What does it look like today because we lost them? And I think when we start digging into those questions, we will probably find a whole lot more animals that were and still could influence wildfire.
How do you deal with new developments versus the natural habitat of the beaver?
Um, so new developments as in like places where beavers are starting to live for the first time, like the Arctic. I will speak to that, and if that's not the right way you were thinking of it, please restate your question. So beavers are moving north into the Arctic, and there's a lot of changes that are happening as beavers do move north. One of the things that we're seeing is increased rates of permafrost thaw. I will note that beavers have lived in the Arctic before. They were definitely there 6,000, 8,000, and 10,000 years ago. They go up every time it's really warm. They come back down every time it's really cold. So as they're moving back into these landscapes, there's a lot to be learned about how they're affecting it. But also, I think every single landscape they live in today, even if it's somewhere that they were historically in huge numbers or somewhere where they weren't in huge numbers, the baseline has changed. Like today's North America is so fundamentally different, and the climate is so fundamentally different than it was throughout most of the 10,000 years prior, or the Holocene, that when we see beavers move north, or when we see beavers occupy a desert, or when we see beavers engineer a city, the question isn't for me necessarily, well, what would it have looked like 20 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 400 years ago? The question is, what are beavers doing today to deal with the challenges we face today? We have more storms today. We have hotter temperatures today. How do beavers interact with those disturbances? Because we have to figure out our today situation to save the tomorrow situation. Then when we have the luxury of time, I would love to look back in more detail at the past situations.
Donald Sayre or Sari, I'm not sure how that's pronounced. If you haven't heard of Ologies podcast, you should consider being a guest. If it's science theme and has a lot of reach, your research would be perfect for one of their episodes.
Thank you. I do love Ologies. It's a great podcast.
And Kathy Stroud says, as a former wetland scientist, I'm a big fan of beavers. I'm glad to hear that engineers are addressing the culvert problems. And there are too many road culverts that beavers think are a great base for their dams.
Yeah, so beavers absolutely love to plug up road culverts. It's one of the biggest conflicts we have. And I have definitely made the joke before when people say, like, how do I bring back beavers? Should I plant willow? Should I build a beaver dam analog? I'm like, no, just build a culvert. They'll be there tomorrow, I promise. It's not necessarily true, but they really do love to dam up culverts. And to that point, we have also gotten really good at figuring out how to stop them from damming culverts. Turns out, as great of engineers as beavers are, if you build a trapezoid-shaped fence around the culvert, they cannot wrap their rodent brains around how to dam that, and they just can't. So we can out-engineer them sometimes. A plus for us.
It looks like it's all of our questions. I'd like to thank Dr. Emily Fairfax. This was a really neat presentation and saw a number of videos online. So please check out YouTube. There are quite a number of videos online along these lines with some interesting other takes, and I especially like the stop motion one. So thank you very much for being our keynote for today.
Of course, thank you.